Welcome to Haunted Hills Podcast, True Crime from Lakes Entrance. I'm your host, Tegan Dawson. The traditional custodians of this land are the Tatungalong people of the Gunai Nation. Also a quick note, this episode contains the names of people who have died. Lakes Entrance has a death sentence case. When I ran crime tours, people would guess death sentence as the penalty a lot. In Victoria, Australia, we did not have many death sentences in comparison to the volume of crime. I'll let you decide which one's the death sentence case in this one. You will find out as well. When Haunted Hills looks at crimes, it's a reflection of the past, the values, timeliness, and sense of justice. While I encourage you to play judge and jury, we're not re-adjudicating these crimes. Most of them occurred too long ago for that to be appropriate. However, the discussions these create a contrast of values. The offences covered reflect the rural nature of our towns, shedding light on the people we don't usually talk about and what is and was considered criminal. When it comes to crime, small towns have an interesting conversation, especially holiday towns. They like to say crime is brought in from outsiders. Then there are other crimes we turn a blind eye to because it's not our business. Like the kind that happens behind other people's unlocked doors. So what does true crime look like in Lakes Entrance before 1950? How are crimes punished? And what does justice look like? The first crime is of con artistry. Two overdressed men in suits and gold chains with slim leather boots high up the ankle arrived in Bairnsdale, Victoria. Just a steamer ride down the Mitchell River to Lakes Entrance. In 1916, there wasn't a name for this fashion choice. However, diamond rings, watches, and necklaces scream gangster and rappers to me today. The tie clips were also bedazzled, but rappers don't usually wear those. It would have been a really interesting look with the 1916 best cut suits. You know, the one with the long tails. They arrived at the Terminus Hotel, Bairnsdale, with an entourage of luggage, including the normal things one travels with. Suitcases of clothes, hat boxes, and rugs. After a day of shopping at the local shops, they retired to the bar, drinking the finest liqueurs, and not a skerrick of beer. This was noticed by the locals, which attracted them a lot of attention. Their top-shelf tastes also extended to the tobacco they were smoking as well. One of the purchases was a gun. Tongues wagged and hearts were aflutter around these men. The men found two women who were wanting to spend time with them. They invited them to join them in Lakes Entrance. The women agreed to the seaside holiday with the men. It was a stunning spring day when the steamer docked at Lakes Entrance. There was already a stir about them in the small town, and people noticed them, which is potentially what they wanted dressed in their audacious style. Constable Ryan, who thought one of the men looked familiar, like a 28-year-old man born in Warragul, he asked the men their names, saying their luggage was not marked with their names, but instead, their leather suitcases were covered in stickers from Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. The men said, "Fancy asking us our name." This just piqued the interest of the police even more. So one morning when the tourists went out shooting with the ladies, with their Hollis gun, the same type of rifle the Victoria Police used at the time, the police investigated their rooms at Chris Lawrence's Central Hotel. Police discovered they were named Richard and George. They each had one of the best rooms filled with their new luggage and other people's luggage. There were labels of surnames such as Bishop and Walker on some of the underwear. Loaded dice were among the possessions found in Richard's room. A clipping of a Sydney newspaper was found, raising police's suspicions even more. It was about a man who'd bought shares in a racehorse, which ended up not being real. They sent word to the Chief Commissioner in Melbourne about their suspicions and what they'd found. The Chief Commissioner said they needed to do further investigation, so they did. After the men had returned and were in their room, the police entered. The search and questioning showed evidence that the men had defrauded a man in Melbourne of £300. Nerd note! The total change in cost over this time is 5,056.5% over 103 years, at an average annual inflation rate of 3.9%. £300 is roughly equivalent to $600, although the cost of living was much lower. For example, a £4 loaf of bread was 4 dimes, which is 3 cents. So little that if you'd saved that amount since 1916 until 2019, you would only have $1.72, which wouldn't buy you a loaf of bread in Australia, so their buying power was so much more. The conmen were charged with defrauding George Yang in Melbourne, and that without the stolen money they had no means to support themselves, which is a vagrancy charge. The two men had met George at a coffee palace in Melbourne and sold him the shares in racehorses they did not have. They took the money, cashed the cheque, and never delivered the papers. What do you think should happen? Latrobe Valley paranormal detectives said you'd think that maybe they would get in contact with Melbourne to check whether the news article was true, and if so, get descriptions of the men involved. In 1916, the court resolved this case. Richard was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment. George absconded after getting bail and disappeared prior to sentencing. He was found 2 years later in Sydney, New South Wales. This time, they knew better than to give him bail. He was returned to Melbourne, and a month later, a jury convicted him as guilty as well, and he was sentenced to 1 year and 9 months in prison. The next case is a murder. Murdering a friend. Frederick Dowsey, 24, and Charles Strange, 21, made fast friends while fencing for a farmer in Delegate, New South Wales. Fred was a head taller, but Charles was broader. They both had blonde hair. Fred had recently lost £150 investing in a gold mine in Wyalong, New South Wales, with his brother the year before. His financial situation became so bad that he had asked the local police for some help with some money, who'd happily given it to him because he'd known him for 14 years or more. He was well known and liked by the locals. He had good social skills and loved entertaining others with card tricks. The work had finished up and both men were heading to Melbourne to reunite with the women in their lives. Fred had hoped to marry his fiancée, and Charles was married 2 years earlier. Fred paid at every stop the two men obtained supplies, food or drink. Fred was generous with his time and his money. I'm speculating here, but maybe this giving nature may have been born from his own hard luck period, so vividly in his memory the year before. Maybe feeling he needed to give back was the only way he could pay back the goodness of others. After a few days, they arrived in Lakes Entrance and set up camp just near Road Knights Hotel, off the main thoroughfare on the Melbourne side of town. Just another stop on their journey back to Melbourne. They chose to take the land as opposed to the boat, which was cheaper but longer. They shared a tent and had 2 bunk beds inside. In the morning, Charles was packing up the camp and throwing things like clothes on a fire, when the Road Knights groomsmen came down searching for Fred to explain the card trick he'd shown the night before. William Meager had stayed up most of the night thinking about it. William said as he glanced around the wooded area behind the scurry of activity, "We had a row. He's gone back to Monaro." Charles was in the middle of pulling down the tent and about to put it on the fire. "What are you doing with that tent?" William asked. "I don't need to carry it further. Nearly back home to the wife in Melbourne." "I'll have it," William said. "Sure." Charles gave him the tent, some boots, and a tomahawk. He casually handed off the axe head and blade in reverse, still covered in blood, the murder weapon. The farmhand didn't know this at the time. The groomsman noticed blood on the tent as he held the bundle on his way back to Roadknight's house. He saw Joan Roadknight and informed her. She made him take her down to where he'd seen Charles in the camp. When they got there, Charles was gone. She found a bloodstain at the head of the bunk, which had been set up. They knew this from the marks on the ground. They followed drag marks on the ground to the edge of the gorge, where they saw a body with a blanket over the head, with scattered branches and twigs between two logs. Sometime after this, William sold his bundle for 9 shillings to people who lived near Braggalong, 100 kilometres from Lakes, who later received a visit from the police to retrieve them. Joan determined to call the police. An investigation commenced. Charles was already gone, so the Cunningham police called ahead to Bairnsdale, letting them know about the man they had questions for. An officer from Bairnsdale met Charles on the road and returned him to Lake's entrance for questioning in chains. Before he was questioned, 3 police officers recovered the body of Frederick, dressed in shorts and a blood-soaked singlet, with a sugar sack tied over his head. They sent him to Bairnsdale for the local doctor to perform an autopsy. The police turned to the last person known to have seen Frederick alive, Charles. The constabulary had already heard from William Meyer, who was under the impression Fred was on the road heading east. The police sat down with Charles at the station in Lake's entrance. Charles said that after the card games finished and the spectators left, they were drinking and talking. It turned to the subject of women, in particular a daughter of a previous employer of the 2 of them. Charles informed the disrespectful nature of his comments led him to a fit of rage, which he yelled, "You are a liar!" and took up a tomahawk and chopped into the head of his friend. At court, Charles had one of the best and most notable attorneys of the time. As it was a death sentence case, it was held in Sale at the Supreme Court. A coroner's inquest had earlier determined the cause of death was homicide. The prosecution invited the medical examiner. He said, while Fred's head was savagely cut into with an axe, the blood flow indicated he lay in bed. As his head bled, the examiner surmised as his head bled, he gasped for air. It was then the attacker stabbed him a number of times in the chest, one of the blows piercing a lung. This explained the blood on the singlet which pulled at the knife wounds. The medical examiner said the bag over his head was to stop the killer having seen the destruction caused. The defense maintained the wounds occurred in the heat of the moment. This caused the public gallery to laugh raucously. While the court maintained their composure, they did nothing to quiet the reaction. The defense and Charles probably thought it best to keep the story, because who in cold blood would attack a sleeping man who financially supported him? The police informed the court Fred was missing about £9 and believed that the motive was robbery. This elicited further guffaws from the crowd. If this was a reason to kill a man while he slept, it was a pretty poor one. The money could have been taken and Charles could have disappeared before Fred awoke. Whatever the true motive for the man's life taken, we may never know, but he died brutally. Charles' defense team discovered there was a history of mental illness in his family. They asked his father to witness to this fact, which he did. Charles's grandfather was sent to a workhouse in 1856 to 1857 for the insane. The records were not clear about his ailment. The newspaper clippings didn't go into detail. However, what is absent is criminal convictions against his grandfather. So, while he may have had a malady, it did not cause criminality or murder as described at the time. This is not to say the home life was perfect or stable. However, this would have affected his father. Charles never met his grandfather, long in the ground before his arrival. While genetics play a factor in mental health issues, criminality is not a given with any mental health challenge, especially when appropriately treated and managed. Charles Henry Strange, the first born in 1874 of 4 to blacksmith William Henry Strange and Louisa Maria Rotten. He had an elder half-sister from his father's first marriage to Mary Misen, 22, Matilda Marion Strange, who lived with them. The firstborn was a half-brother, Thomas James Strange, who lived with his maternal grandparents. Thomas, named after his mother's father, was a fancy cabinet maker with his wife Clara Collins Overland, who polished the furniture he made. Clara's father was a painter, and she most likely learned this skill with him. Thomas and Clara worked together and had a child they named after himself. He was in and out of workhouses, listed as having a temporary disability. However, all this began after Charles Strange died, where he brought up his family. His wife Clara was in the workhouse for a year as a child, and discharged back to her mother's care. She was there with a sibling. Mary, their mother, had passed away in 1872. This was his father's second marriage. He was a widower. William Henry was the firstborn child of two. His brother was born 4 years after him. Charles's father appeared to have stable employment and lived in Melbourne before 1891, where his youngest sister was born. Charles was not named in his mother's death notice 14 years later, in 1910. What do you think should happen? How do you think the court resolved this in 1895? Latrobe Valley Paranormal Detectives said, life or death sentence. The judge sentenced Charles to death in December. The Criminologist Society prepared a petition for the Victorian Governor to reduce the sentence to life imprisonment sometime after Christmas. It was denied, and Charles hung before Valentine's Day. He walked the scaffold that 1896 day to the noose without visible trembling. When asked for his last words, he said, "No, sir." It rang out across the scattered witnesses, reverberating in the hall, just before the trapdoor snapped open and killed him instantly. The last visitor was his wife Rachel of a year and a bit, alongside the priest. Within the year, Rachel put this marriage behind her, marrying a cook, and lived in Auburn. A year later, they had their first child. Rachel died 30 years later at 55 years of age, her second daughter of a contractor from Tasmania, with 13 brothers and sisters. As the firstborn girl, she was named after her mother. The crime record: a stolen gun. Mr. A. Oliver's sharebroker, The Grange, Dromane Road, St Kilda, reports that on the 11th, a double-barrelled breech barbing hammerless gun, maker Healy, Oxford Street, London, in an old leather case was stolen from the SS Romeo between Sale and the Lakes Entrance, Gippsland. The gun is valued at £38. The next case is a joyride. A 6-cylinder Hoopmobile sedan was stolen from Northcote, Melbourne in 1933, joyriding its way through a few robberies to Gippsland. They'd stopped at the Longwarry and Druin. The timing indicated to the police thieves had a car. The trip took all but an hour. They broke into the petrol bowser at Stratford, filling 8-gallon milk cans with petrol. After filling the tank of the car. A few more kilometres down the road, they broke into the refreshment room at the Bairnsdale train station, making themselves a very Aussie meal of meat pies. They didn't do the dishes, which let the police know 3 men were there, taking all the fixings for tobacco, aspirin. The men bundled up too much in their arms or were disturbed in the process, as items were left strewn around the room. All local police in the area were alerted. Mounted Constable Campbell and Constable Creed of Lakes Entrance went out searching. They found the car and the men asleep near Swan Reach. They scrambled to escape, however they were too drowsy. 3 men were brought into custody, a shoemaker, 17, a mechanic, 19, and an engineer, 20. Housebreaking tools were also found in the car. The men were remanded to Lakes Entrance for their trial. William Allen, 17, was a shoemaker. He'd lost his father in the First World War. His mother reared him on her own. He'd not been in trouble for the past 18 months until he fell into the company of poor influences. She asked he not be sent to prison. She said he had suffered from a head injury after falling from a motorbike, saying his judgment was impaired as a result. He was under 18 and she was asking that he not go to prison. Clifton Arthur Burridge and Arthur Harry Harris were also tried as adults. How do you think the court dealt with this? Stealing motorcars was very common, and the courts were not wanting to treat it trifling. The men were all sentenced to indefinite terms of imprisonment. Only the 17-year-old at a reformatory school. It does appear, though, that they were released from prison within 9 years, because one of the men is married in 1942. Netting in closed waters. A fisherman netted the Tambo River at the mouth, which is a contravention of the 1915 Fisheries Act. The fisherman contended it was not that far down the river when he had set it, and a volume of high water had caused the net to move. The fisheries officer, Constable Ryan, had seen the net because there were 50 to 60 cork buoys on the top of the water, showing the line of the net, which were inside the closed water boundary, which was 400 feet from any mouth of a river. This net was 200 feet in. The court case was held. There were lots of experts, from other fishermen to fisheries staff. Eventually the court was cleared out, and in the end the justices decided it was neglectful for the fisherman not to check his nets after wild weather, and fined him £2 and £5 in court costs. Attempted murder. Philip's wife and daughter had left home due to his increase in drinking and violent behaviour over the days earlier. Philip sent his son Eric to bring them home. Eric was with a friend at the time. The request was made with a .303 rifle pointed at them. With 3 shells in the gun. Philip followed them out into the yard and shot at them. Then shot also at the neighbour's boy. Both shots missed, but landing closely to where both young men had been. The 2 young men raced to the neighbour's house, who was sitting on the veranda. They looked back to see Philip using the post to steady the rifle as he aimed the gun. It discharged and struck 20 metres from them. The police were called for, and they arrested Philip, charging him with shooting with intent to murder. What do you think should happen? What do you think does happen? So there were many court cases leading up to the final court case for this case. There were many court cases leading up to the final judgment. One of the justices said he could not decide the case alone, that it was weak, and he would let it go to jury. On the day of the final judgment, the judge decided the son's evidence changed slightly, and the case was struck out, discharged on February 22, 1916. There was no court case and no further intervention in the household. Philip was 27 when he married Florence, who was 20 in 1892. They had 4 children in 9 years. Their eldest child, Percival Philip, was born in Swan Reach, which, as we've discussed, is not far from Lakes Entrance. He was born in 1893, a year after their wedding. In 1895, Phyllis Ruth Hancock was born, their eldest daughter. Unfortunately, this was the year Percival Philip passed away. Phyllis married Alfred Howlett, a metal machinist, in 1915. She was not living in the house when her father had this break, and had moved to Queensland. Eric, the child shot at, was their third-born child in 1899. Florence, the sister who had left with her mother, was born in 1902. Florence Edith Hancock, Philip's wife, was the postmistress in Cunningham in 1903. In the later years, she stopped working, even as her children were all past school age. Philip was a labourer in 1903. By 1930, he was a photographer. They were still married, and she was listed with home duties. Philip was listed on Eric's military sign-up sheet, which was signed in May 1917. It was a sports day in Lakes Entrance in 1901. It brought the entire community together, including the Aboriginal people of Lake Tyers Mission. During the course of the day, there was drinking and sports. Henry Barrett had a fight with his wife and father-in-law. The fight with his father-in-law led to physical injuries around his head. His wife ran to Rigby's hotel. Distressed, with a child in her arms, she slid under a table. Word came along that Henry had found out his wife was in the hotel, and he was headed there. The licensee loaded his rifle and met Henry, who was climbing the stairs to the hotel. He told him not to come in. A verbal dispute ensued. Henry verbally threatened the licensee. As he continued up the stairs, he was told not to proceed, and the hotel keeper shot him in the knee. Henry fell to the ground, bleeding profusely. They applied a tourniquet and called for a doctor. However, as a shotgun has pellets, 25 of them had spread out in his leg and pierced the artery. He bled out and died. They say his dying confession in front of witnesses said he was upset after losing a lot of money, that he drank so much he became drunk. Henry Barrett was an Aboriginal man from New South Wales. The shooting and killing of Henry upset the Aboriginal community, and they wanted vengeance. Rigby, the hotel owner, was charged with manslaughter, and they let him out on bail the same day. Henry was 38 years old. He'd lived at Lake Tyers for a while. He'd obtained a working permit to work at Lake Tyers sawmill, where they said he was a good worker, intelligent, and had a good work ethic. He earned £3. Rigby said he was trying to cripple him, and later he said he just wanted to scare him. What do you think should happen? How do you think the court dealt with this? The court, in May 1901, resolved a sentence of not guilty. Thank you, listeners, for your time and your ears. I hope you've had a fascinating journey through the Lakes Entrance small town criminals. I hope wherever you were it was enlightening. The next episode is Malakuta history, where we will be looking at the small Victorian town right on the eastern edge where sun rises over the ocean. This podcast was produced, researched, written and narrated by me, Tegan Dawson, on Gunai-Kurnai land in Moe, Victoria. Haunted Hills acknowledges the Bradalong people of the Gunai-Kurnai Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land they operate on. Much of the country they speak of is Aboriginal land, always was, always is. We respect the elders, people, culture, past, present, and hope for a positive future on all these lands that were never ceded. The intro and outro music was by Aaron Austin Music. Be kind, thoughtful, stay safe.